let's start with the two last riders, Texas and OU. Last time in the conference, Texas, we talked about the preseason poll. They are picked number one, the first time since the Big 12 has been without divisions that the Longhorns are the favorite. Max, I'll start with you. What do you think about their potential of making it to the championship game, and how justified these expectations are for the Longhorns?
Yeah, I think that it's not. I mean, part of it is you go through the rest of the list, and there's not. I think TCU lost a lot off of the team that reached the national championship game last year. K-State lost some big names off that squad, so you kind of get part of it is voters having a little bit of confusion over who to go with here. And I think Texas, just on paper, they're the team that you go through it. They got 14 or 15 starters returning. You've got the quarterback. You've got one of the best receivers in the country. You've got a young offensive line last year that now is pretty impressive looking and really got better over the course of the season. And you saw defense take a big step under PK in year two. So it kind of makes sense. I think the expectations are fair that Texas should be number one just on paper. And the expectations should be, I think you set the Alabama game aside because obviously that's a tough test going into Tuscaloosa, but shoot, I think any game they lose in the Big 12, people are going to be pretty unhappy in Austin, because I think the standard here, I'm not saying the standard is 12-0 by any means, but I think they're going to be favored in pretty much every game this year, you would think.
Max, do you have a lot of faith in them to maintain the week to week? I'm not going to say grind, but just like show up every week under Sark and where their culture is right now and the mindset of teams, because that's been the issue with Texas is peak Texas, when they played at their best, scares you, and they have for most of the last decade with a couple exceptions. But there's always the Kansas or the Iowa State or the game that trips up and you see them at their worst. Do you see reason to believe that this Texas team can show up every week?
Well, the good news is they have three quarterbacks. I don't think there's anybody else in the conference who feels like they're pretty set 1-3.
Yeah.
So I think, and obviously, Texas ran into that last year. And if they don't lose Quinn Ewers against Alabama, you can say, oh, maybe they would have beat Alabama with Quinn Ewers, but they certainly may have beat Texas Tech and reached the Big 12 title game if they had not dealt with the Quinn Ewers injury last year. So, I think that having that security, I think, helps a little bit. Having the staff stability that Texas has had under Sark here going into year three, I think is pretty impressive. That's a group that has really stuck together and has been able to build something, and I think there's a couple spots you kind of circle. I think running back obviously is a really important one. It goes without saying that, Bijan Robinson and Roschon Johnson are really hard to replace. I think they've got a very talented room of running backs, and they're no one's recruiting better than them, it seems like, in running back lately with Tashard Choice. But there's some of those spots that you feel like, okay, there's a little bit of a question mark, but overall, defensively, they've got a lot back. They've got the preseason Big 12 Defensive Player of the Year in Jalen Ford. They've got a bunch of leaders on that group. So, I think that there's going to, obviously, they're still going to end up in a bunch of close games, just as they did last year. And we'll talk about that plenty with this conference. But I think you feel like from a depth standpoint, it's hard not to say they've got everything they need to go make a run now.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think everything is kind of set up for the Longhorns this year. And I feel like if you don't get it done this year, if you don't at least get to the Big 12 title game, then I think you have to have some questions about the long-term future outlook of this program, because it's not going to get any easier when they go into the SEC in 2024. Meanwhile, across the Red River, you've got the Sooners, who are looking to bounce back from a tough year last year. Year two for Brent Venables. I'm curious, David, I'll pose this question to you. Who do you think is under more pressure going into this season, Steve Sarkisian or Brent Venables?
I mean, you got to have, I would definitely say Venables. I think when you're coming off of a year like that, where your name is getting mentioned in the same sentence as John Blake, that's not good. That's not a good place to be. And you had so many things. I mean, when people can't figure out what the true low light of year one was, that's another problem. Like that to me, I mean, both, I think the pressure to win at Texas and Oklahoma is pretty similar. But I think it feels bigger at Texas because they haven't won it. Oklahoma, they're used to winning big, winning the Big 12, getting to playoffs. And so the hunger might not be there in the same way. But you go 6-7 again, you got some real questions going into the ACC. You go 8-4. you got some questions going in the SEC. So I think it's Venables by a wide margin, especially as a first-time head coach as well.
Max, you spent some time up there and wrote about Oklahoma and the way they're trying to address that program. I talked to Joe Castiglione recently when he was in Houston, and he seems to have full confidence in Venables. What's your sense on the confidence level of Oklahoma being able to take that next step this year?
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely backing Brent Venables, and I don't think people are necessarily looking at year one as a reflection that this guy can't get the job done. I think it's probably too early to make that assessment. And when you look at this Oklahoma program, and I wrote about this, recently on the Athletic, the thing that's pretty startling is how much that roster has turned over going into year two at Oklahoma. I mean, for Brent Venables, like, this staff has signed more than 80 scholarship players in 18 months on the job. They've completely turned this around. Now, that doesn't mean that they've got everything they need. That doesn't mean that they're hitting on every single transfer they've taken, and they've taken more than 30. They've taken a bunch since they got there. I think it's going to take time. They really like the freshman class, and that group's going to take some time to develop. But man, it's a very brand new team compared to what they were looking at in 2021. And I think it just, in terms of culturally and consistency and all that, I think it's going to take some time for Oklahoma to kind of get right under Brent Venables. But I agree with David that I think there's way more pressure on Brent Venables to prove he's the guy, that he's got the right staff, that he can put all the pieces together here. And frankly, I'm kind of bullish on Oklahoma having a chance to compete for a Big 12 title this year. I don't think they're that far off. I think there's some ugly stuff from last season, but ultimately, if they play better in close games in November last year, they're in the mix. So, that's a team that I feel like if they can take the steps you kind of expect in year two, I'm not expecting like Bob Stoops level year two steps, but I think that ultimately I think it's trending in the right direction. And this year is going to be a big test in terms of just building, I think, approval rating for Brent Venables and Steph as they head into, as David said, a much tougher environment.
At Oklahoma, though, in the portal era, don't when you try to preach patience, especially as we've seen, I think Kalen DeBoer at Washington is a really good example. There's been a handful of others that just overnight flip a program. Doesn't that sort of ring hollow if you're like, well, we got to get some time. We got to get this, especially when you can sign as many guys as you can. You need to hit on portal guys. And again, you're Oklahoma. You're going to be in a league where you have the best, if not the second best, roster in the league.
It's true. He did not take over for a coach who went 4-8. You know what I mean? This is not like, this is not like the kind of, rebuilding that we've seen at Texas and in a bunch of the coaching changes that they've gone through over the past decade. Oklahoma should not be a place where you need to flip the roster because they've been recruiting at a top 10, top 15 level for a long time now. And so that to me is pretty startling that it's changed over that much. And you're right. Like there's the expectations are just kind of different now for a year one. And so is that a reflection more of the talent they had and the lack of depth and competitive depth they had? Because I think that was clearly an issue for them, especially, against good Big 12 teams last year. Or how much of that is coaching and scheme? I think that this is going to be a year that reveals a lot in terms of, do they have the right coach and combination of coaches? Or is this really that the talent did kind of drop off here over the past few years?
So before we move on,
I think in general it's going to be a rough go for Texas and Oklahoma. Everybody's going to be – it's their Super Bowl for everybody this year. Everybody wants to send them to the SEC with a loss. And I think people are underrating that factor because that dynamic is very real.
So before we move on, that leads me, David, into my next question. Oklahoma's picked third in the conference. Texas picked first in the preseason poll. Each of you, I'll start with you, David. Mm-hmm. Do either or both of these teams make the Big 12 title or win the Big 12 title?
One. I'll pick Texas to get there. I don't think they win it.
All right. And then, Max, what do you think? Do one of these teams or both these teams make the Big 12 championship game?
Be kind of incredible if they both made it. Nobody. I think
what a game. Brett Yormark
would maybe call in sick for that trophy presentation. It would be well attended, but I'm not sure the Big 12 folks would be thrilled about handing over that trophy on that Saturday. I'm going to go with one. I think I had to, just in preparation for this, I had to finally throw together my 1 through 14, and I have Texas in the top two.